you for joining us on the 8th day of the 20th anniversary edition of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. My name is Anne Chan, and I'm part of the festival team. We have already had 8 days of online and hybrid events, and we will be running online events all this week until Sunday, the 15th of November. And if you're in Hong Kong, you can also attend our events live at Asia Society and Taikun this weekend, so feel free to drop by. And visit our website festival.org.hk for full details. Today's session is part of our online event series, co-hosted by Asia Society Hong Kong Center, and it will be simultaneously broadcasted on Asia Society's Facebook and YouTube pages, so you can also tune in there. And we're delighted to be joined today by 3 authors, An Yu, Ran Xu, and Eva Lau, to talk about their debut novels published this year. And I'll hand you over to our authors in a minute. But first, I'd like to run you through a few housekeeping points about Crowdcast. So please feel free to post your comments in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen. And if you have any questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom right of the screen. Click on the green button at the bottom of the screen at any time, and you will be connected to the website of our festival bookseller, Bookazine, to buy the authors' books. And all of our authors appear for free, so the best way to thank them and support their work is to buy their books. This event will remain on Crowdcast until the end of November, so you can watch on demand anytime until then. And today's event is trilingual, which is conducted mostly in English with some Cantonese and Chinese. And within 48 hours, we will post a new version with Chinese subtitles added. And finally, I'd like to thank all of our cultural partners, sponsors, and donors for their generous support, which makes all of these events possible. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge an ongoing grant from the Standing Committee on Language Education and Research. And now I'm delighted to introduce the first of our authors, Ran Xu. Ran Xu was born and raised in Hong Kong. The Passion of Hong Kong 2019 is her first novel, and when she's neither reading nor writing, she spends most of her time working at a bank. I'm going to hand over to Ran Xu now to introduce An Yu and Eva Lau. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you guys will have a really great session.
Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. Just before I introduce the others, a quick note to add. I have been advised to, and I've chosen to remain anonymous due to the explicit nature of my, and the political sensitivity of my book. As to why it is explicit and politically sensitive, I would strongly recommend you to check the book out, and then you'll see for yourself. 我喺呢度好快加一句咧，就係因為我本書入邊有一啲比較即係赤裸嘅描寫，同埋有一啲可能政治敏感少少嘅內容啦，所以我被建議同埋我自己都覺得而家應該都未會露面住。咁但係至於點解本書係有赤裸嘅內容或者有政治敏感嘅內容咧，就極力建議大家去文學節嘅嗰個網站嗰度去睇一睇我本書。好啦，now I'll introduce the others. So An Yu was born and raised in Beijing and left at the age of 18 to study in New York at NYU. A graduate of the NYU MFA in creative writing, she writes her fiction in English. She lives between Beijing and Hong Kong. Braised Pork is her first novel. Lau Yiwa is a Hong Kong novelist. She was educated She was educated at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she studied Chinese literature and philosophy. She has a postgraduate diploma in education from the Education University of Hong Kong. After a career as an editor in a publishing house, she has transitioned into education and writing. In 2017, Yua won the Champion of the Awards for Creative Writing in Chinese. Tongueless is her debut novel. I'll add the applause because I think people can only hear from us. All right. Hello. So to start off today's event, I want to make note of the fact that I think it's very interesting how our event is trilingual. And in fact, in our books, we have written in, I would say, 3 different languages. And you wrote in English. You wrote in Chinese in a way that I think leans towards the Cantonese form. And for me, I would I would categorize my book as, written in a more traditional Chinese way. So why don't we start off the conversation by talking a little bit about languages? Let me briefly translate, and then maybe I can ask the first question. 我覺得我哋今日呢一個節目咧，最特別之處就係我哋會用到3個語言啦。咁其實我哋3本小説入邊咧，亦都有用到，即係我會覺得係3種唔同嘅語言。啱嘅書用英文寫成㗎啦。咁綺華咧嘅小説就係用中文，但係入邊亦都有好多廣東話嘅一啲用法。咁而我自己嘅小説，我覺得係偏向於用一個比較傳統嘅中文寫作嘅手法。咁所以我認為我哋可能可以開始先傾下關於語言嘅問題。咁就由我嚟即係問第一個問題，即係拋磚引玉一下啦。So the first question I would like to ask to Eva. As I mentioned just now, I think you used a lot of more like Cantonese habits in your writing. Have you made this decision when you first, outlined your novel, thought about this novel? How do you think this choice corresponds to the story that you're telling?
Okay. Actually， 其實咧，我用廣東話係啊，因為其實咧，我覺得點解我會用呢一個語言，係因為我母語係廣東話啦，咁而香港人嘅母語亦都係廣東話啦，咁而我係想寫一班香港人嘅生活，所以我咧就佢嘅對話咧都係有普通廣東話嘅，但係咧而我嗰本小説裏面咧，個2個角色咧都係中文老師啦。咁喺香港，中文老師係需要考基準試先至可以繼續，即係先可以叫做 qualified to teach 咁樣。咁而嗰個基準試就係普通話係一定要達到一個水平，咁先至可以即係叫做你有一個資格去做中文老師啦。咁所以喺我嘅對白裏面，除咗係有廣東話之外咧，亦都有普通話，就係嗰班老師咧，佢喺度學緊普通話，咁所以咧佢嘅對白咧，亦有啲係用普通話寫成嘅。咁但係如果成本書裏面有一啲廣東話嘅用法你講得啱嘅，即係譬如可能雪櫃啊，或者的士啊咁樣啦。咁我喺本書裏面都有嘅。咁因為我覺得其實呢個真係香港，而我寫緊嘅香港文學嘛，咁所以我就有放埋落去咯，同埋我都有啲英文嘅，因為有一個角色就係一個外國嘅校長，咁所以佢都用英文嚟講，我就好如實咁樣將人物佢哋用嘅語言就寫咗出嚟咁咯，係啊。
Let me very briefly translate what you said. So Eva said that she wrote primarily in Cantonese because Cantonese is her native language and her characters are all Hong Kong people. So she thought that it would be the most appropriate to use Cantonese to write their story. But in fact, the story also has some sort of a little bit of Mandarin in it because one of her characters is trying to learn Mandarin. So the 2 characters in her novels are both Chinese teachers. And in Hong Kong, to become a qualified Chinese teacher, you need to pass a 普通话 test. So one of the teachers in her story is studying for it. And that's why we could also see some Mandarin dialogue in her writing. In addition, there's actually also some English dialogue because her book also has characters that speak English. So also, in addition, Eva also says that she uses a little bit of Cantonese usage in her Chinese writing. So for example, when she mentioned the fridge, she uses the Cantonese way of saying it instead of, I guess, the standard Chinese way of saying it. And she thinks that she wants to do it because it is a story about Hong Kong written by a Hong Kong author. 咁但係咧，我跟進，即係你頭先個答案入邊，你都有提到話，其中一個角色喺度努力學普通話啦。咁我留意到咧，就係佢喺呢個故事入邊，其實係主要係被當成笑話，即係佢身邊嘅同事見到佢學緊普通話嘅時候，對佢嘅態度係好差啦，成日都笑佢啦。咁你覺得點解大家會對佢呢一種嘅努力有呢一種反應咧？或者即係呢個點樣去關係到香港人 嘅身份呢一類嘅問題咧？
其實我覺得香港人係用語言去突顯自己嘅身份認同嘅，因為即係我哋會覺得母語廣東話其實係一種好低級嘅語言，反而即係英文好好或者普通話好好，咁反而係大家會更加覺得你有能力啊，覺得你好勁啊，特別如果你英文係有British 或者 American accent 咁，跟住大家就會覺得你好勁啊咁樣。如果你英文可能都 OK 嘅，但係你係 Hong Kong accent 咧，大家就會可能睇唔起你咁樣。其實普通話都係一樣嘅，即係我覺得，即係你可以講到好流暢、好北京嘅廣東話，咁你係一個香港人嚟嘅，而唔係即係喺北京生活長大嘅話，人哋都覺得哇你好厲害咁樣。但係我哋唔會覺得我哋係一個香港人，我哋講廣東話都係一個好值得驕傲嘅事。但係相反，你即係 compare with Japan and also France 咁，即係佢哋係會覺得。自己嘅母語係好值得驕傲噶嘛，就算日本人英文好差，法國人英文直情唔睇唔起淨係識講英文嘅人，但係佢哋都唔會覺得好差勁嘅。咁喺我嘅小説裏面，嗰兩位角色咧，無論係玲同埋慧咧，都處於一個咁樣嘅狀態，即係佢被逼要學普通話。係咁。而阿慧就覺得自己好差啦，學都學唔識咁樣啦。咁另一方面，除咗學普通話之外，亦都有啲中文老師係學英文嘅，即係覺得啊學英文好好啊，好正啊咁樣。咁但係冇一個人會覺得啊，其實普通話、廣東話都 OK 嘅喎，點解我唔可以用廣東話教中文嘅咧？咁即係我會覺得係一種好諷刺嘅事咯，係啊。所以你問呢個問題，即係點解？反映到香港嘅身份認同，我覺得喺香港語言就好似一個戰場咁樣嘅，即係既然係一種不斷喺度競爭咁樣咯，用另一種嘅語言去表現自己或者認同自己，香港人就係咁樣咯。
Okay. Let me just quickly translate my question and Eva's answer. So I asked Eva. As one of her characters are trying very hard to learn Mandarin in the story, and she is, mocked by her colleagues. People laugh at her, thinking that she's very weird. So I wanted to ask Eva why she thought people would react this way to a person who's trying to learn Mandarin in Hong Kong, and how that relates to the identity of being a person from Hong Kong, a Hong Konger. And Eva says that she thinks in Hong Kong, there's a lot of hierarchy in language. If you can speak very good English with, British accent, American accent, people would already automatically think that you're better than others. And this goes the same for Mandarin as well. People look up to like others who could speak fluent Mandarin. And in the story, not only are the teachers trying very hard to learn Mandarin, some of the teachers also try to, take exams, take English level exams, etc. And so Eva feels that language is really sort of like a battlefield in Hong Kong, where everyone is trying very hard to be something else. And she thinks that, why are we always thinking about learning another language or becoming very good at another language when we don't appreciate the language that we already speak, which is Cantonese? So I mean, I think in reaction to that, I actually think that it ties very well to what you mentioned just now about writing in a form of Chinese that's more like Cantonese. Because Eva, you mentioned how you wanted to write in a more Cantonese way because it's a Hong Kong person writing a Hong Kong novel. And I think that this sentiment, this is sort of like a result of what you mentioned about how Cantonese should also be very much treasured as a language. Yeah.
Can I interject with something?
Please.
A comment?
Please comment.
So just speaking about Eva's writing as being a Cantonese person writing about a Cantonese story, I just wanted to ask Ran you a question about, because you are from Hong Kong as well, and you are writing a story that is set in Hong Kong, but it's also set in a school, and a lot of the conflict within your story is between nationalities, and therefore that implies, there's a language tension in there as well. And I think reading your book, as you mentioned before, you use more of a traditional kind of Chinese language to write. But of course, the characters, some of them are speaking in English, some of them are speaking in Mandarin Chinese, some of them are speaking in Cantonese. And I just want to hear a little bit about your decision process behind that. And also, since you are trilingual, did that, multilingual way of writing come naturally to you? And do you think that you would have, been able to, I guess, tell the story in just one language?
So for me, it just naturally came to me when I was imagining all these people in my head. It naturally came to me that they would be speaking in these 3 different languages, because I feel that when you speak in different languages, the way that you think is completely different, and like the framework that you think in, or the way that you see things, there's a nuance to it. Even just now when I was translating for Eva, I had to switch the sentences around a little because of the way the logic works. So in answer to your question, from the start, I already always imagined these people speaking in different languages. And I think that also affects the way that they take action. For example, to me, this is maybe a generalization, but I think that it could be easier to speak in English about something that's very sexually explicit, or something that's, more emotional, than it is in Cantonese. I think in Cantonese, we seldom talk about feelings directly. And so this affects the actions, or like the way that the characters are as well. For example, Victoria in my novel, I feel that she's much more open about sexuality, much more open about her feelings, much more sort of aggressive even to the protagonist, from the protagonist's point of view, because of all these things that she could say. So that's one aspect of it. I think another thing that that I think this different languages thing helped with my novel is that I really wanted to bring out how these 3 people are from different places and different backgrounds, and there are so many things that they don't have in common. And I think that by having them speak in different languages, and even having them to react to it in the novel, like in the novel, you would see maybe the protagonist thinking, oh, like, how do I say this in English to an English-speaking character? Like, this kind of thing to me is quite important, because I want to show that they start off being these like 3 distant people that in the end get tangled up in one, big, weird power dynamic situation. So yes, I think language has been a very important tool in my writing. But this also makes me think about your novel, because you're writing in English about a woman who speaks Chinese, and her whole, I guess, like, different from my novel where the characters speak different languages. In your novel, actually everyone, I think, is supposed to be speaking Chinese. So how does that work? Like, how did the dialogue sound in your, like, did you also think in Chinese before writing, or what did you think about the process?
I mean, of course, the whole story, at least the dialogue part, all came to me in Chinese at first, because I think that's the most natural way for me to think about what these characters might be saying.
Yeah.
But the result of that is that oftentimes when I'm writing the dialogue down in English, a lot of the things that did come into my mind have to be filtered out, because either they don't make sense in English, or they're difficult to be completely translated into English. And if I do translate the Chinese into English, I will have to use an English idiom, for example. And then suddenly the dialogue would sound odd, because, the reader is reading about these people speaking in Chinese, and they suddenly hear an English idiom. And then to me, that would sound off. So I'd rather take out that sentiment and strip the dialogue down to, very simple terms, so that it feels almost languageless to me. I think it was writing in English was a conscious decision before I started writing the novel. And of course, as I kept writing, I also translated back and forth from Chinese to English, and then English back to Chinese, and then again, and then again.
Did you actually write down the Chinese when you were writing?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes I also wrote paragraphs in Chinese and then translated it into English.
we have to talk about this more.
Yeah. So I would see, you know, like if I wrote something in English, I feel like it's a bit off, and then I translate it into Chinese, and then I translate what I wrote in Chinese back into English. Suddenly it feels more authentic in both languages, in both Chinese and English. So I found that process to be really interesting and really rewarding. And I suppose in the end, I'm quite happy with the choice of having written it in English, mainly because I think perhaps when I began the novel, I was thinking about, you know, stories set in China, stories set around me, Chinese authors, you know, writing novels. And I feel like I wanted to write a story that was a Chinese story, but it didn't solely exist in the society of China, which I think many novels might give readers, especially Western readers, that feeling of, you know, I'm reading a story about China, and these events are not very relatable to a non-Chinese writer or reader. And, you know, it might be interesting, but, you know, this is a Chinese story. And I didn't want that. I wanted the story to be a Chinese story that it could have also happened somewhere else. I wanted it to be, you know, a human story, essentially. So I think, I think that was part of the, you know, the reason why I did write in English.
I think, like, as I've also mentioned to you before, maybe when I started reading your novel, at least for the first chapter, I really couldn't tell yes, like you could tell from the characters' names, but you wouldn't tell from the writing right off where they are. Like it seems like they're in a big city, but it could be, you know, in New York, it could be in Beijing. So I really think the language-less, I love this word, aspect of it really shows. And that's something quite unique to me.
I mean, I think it's just one more thing. I think it's just a reflection of how people or these characters are experiencing the world around them. They're not experiencing the world like I'm in China, right? They're experiencing the world like how we are experiencing our room around us right now. We're not consciously thinking about what culture we're in.
Right.
So I wanted that to come across on the page. I'm glad it did.
No, it definitely did. Look, we've talked about the differences that we have in terms of language, but I think that maybe it's time for us to discuss something that we have in common, which is that the three of us are all writing about women. We are women ourselves, and our protagonists are women. And I think that whether we did it intentionally or not, there are things that we describe that might be, you know, more of a female experience. So maybe we could chat a little bit about that as well. Let me quickly translate. 我覺得我哋即係頭先討論到書入邊，我哋三個嘅書入邊嘅唔同嘅語言啦。咁但係我諗另外一個我哋有嘅共通點咧，就係我哋三個都係寫關於女人嘅故事，無論係我哋專登去咁樣做啊，定係即係可能無意中咁樣做咗啦。但係我諗我哋書入邊有一啲內容其實係可能係同女性嘅經驗係好有關係。咁所以我哋可以討論一下關於即係女性呢一個層面嘅嘢啦。咁maybe 可能我問下以華先啦，因為頭先我哋都講咗好啦，就係即係你本書入邊有兩個女主角。咁我覺得有一個即係其中一個咧就係好鮮明嘅一個港女嘅形象咁樣啦。咁另外一個咧就係同佢好似完全唔一樣咁。咁你會唔會即係你覺得佢哋兩個作為女性，即係有冇一啲共通點，或者即係佢哋之間嘅女性嘅經驗係乜嘢咧？
其實咧，我寫呢一本小説嘅時候咧，我係冇乜點樣去諗女性嘅經驗嘅。點解我會特別寫女性咧？係因為我個人嘅經驗嚟嘅啫。因為我讀 中文系啦嚇，咁中文系有超過80%都係女仔，而中文系大部分嘅畢業生都係會做中文老師。咁而我即係以前去實習咁樣啦，咁即係嗰間學校亦都係非常之多女老師嘅，咁所以即係因為咁嘅緣故，所以我就真係以女老師作為一個題材咯。咁而發展落去，點解我會寫到阿玲咁港女咧？因為我想即係表現香港人嘅一啲典型嘅特質咁樣。咁我就將嗰啲港女嘅嘢咧就黐咗喺佢身上咁樣。同埋嗰啲着衫嗰啲，其實我都係有諗過，即係好似一個身份認同咁樣。即係香港人係好中意名牌噶嘛，咁就好似啲牌子喺身上面貼，咁一定要外國先好嘅喎。咁如果一個袋好貴嘅，但係香港製造嘅，大家唔會覺得哇好勁啊咁樣嘅喎。但係一個 Gucci 或者 LV 袋咁，跟住大家就覺得好似好厲害咁樣。咁我都有即係從呢個方面去諗，其實香港人點解會係咁咯？咁所以你話係咪一個好寫女性嘅經驗咧？我覺得唔係嘅，對比起你哋兩個嘅話，係啊。
但係我覺得即係我都有類似嘅同感，就係可能我翻譯咗先啦。Maybe I'll translate what I asked Eva and her answer. So in Eva's novel, both of her sort of main characters are women, and I asked her what she thought about their female experience, whether there's anything particularly she thought of from a more female perspective, and how she compares the two of them. And Eva says that actually she didn't start off, deliberately wanting to write about women, but this is more based on her personal experience because she worked at a school before, and most of them were women. And then when she went to study education, most of her classmates were women. So it came to her naturally that, people in this environment are mostly female. But as she writes, she starts to give one of her characters, Ling, a more traditional Hong Kong girl image. And that's because she thinks that it really shows how Hong Kong people are, how Hong Kong people try to chase after brand names or like physical things, like how her characters tries to buy LV bags, Gucci bags. She thinks that this is a really good reflection of the way that the general, how she thinks Hong Kong people are like. So essentially, I think she thinks that writing about female adds to her goal to trying to portray the Hong Kong society. And I think I really identify with that because even though my novel has a female protagonist, I actually also didn't start off thinking, oh, why don't I write about women? It's more because I haven't been a man, and I guess like as my first novel, it is the lazier way to write, about something that you personally experienced more. So yeah, I understand what you said when you say that you didn't think of writing about women. But what about go ahead.
但係我想問許然咧，即係你話 you are lazy because you're a woman, so you write it in your woman. But I found that 陳一心 as a female, maybe it is a metaphor of Hong Kong as well, because a lot of people said Hong Kong just like a prostitute, something like that, is a woman. And I just think that you deliberately do that. You don't do it in this way.
So, okay, that's an interesting question, because a lot of people have asked me about the symbolism behind my characters as well. I think to the reader now it would seem like Tanya Sum, she's a symbol of Hong Kong, and then Victoria is a symbol, could be seen to be representing the UK, and the guy representing China. But even though this symbolism was at the back of my head when I was writing the novel, my main focus during the writing process was still to tell the story about three people, and how they were all very different and end up tangled together in their whatever power dynamic that they have. So actually, the writing was very driven by the plot and the small scale writing about three people thing. But in retrospect, when I think about it, I think that the fact that Chen Yesam is a woman and her sexual journey throughout this novel is so explicit. She tried so many weird things. Like that is not as typical for women as it is for a man. So what I mean is, if I write about a man who's, trying all these things, people would not find it so odd as they might with a woman. And I think that this kind of lack of comfort or this kind of in-betweenness or like, being thrown into a situation that you're not familiar with or not expected to do, to me is a kind of parallel to the situation that that our city is in right now, the kind of, being stretched. So yes, I think that is the main point for me about the identity. But
I mean, John, sorry.
No, you speak.
No, I mean, I think you say you, just like Eva, didn't really consciously choose to write about women, but you do carve out, very strong female characters. And 就是我感觉你在你的书里，我看你的书的时候，我觉得你刻画的这些女性角色都好像她们心里面内心深处有一个永远填不满的洞，一直在扩张到好像要把她们吃了一样。So there's this sense of like urgency that's going, there's a hole that's about to like eat them up. And throughout the novel, 我感觉这些女性角色的这种怎么说饥渴感吧，就是不管他们怎么样去if they turn to their sexual drive 性欲或者情欲或者暴力等等，他们都是没有办法被满足的。可能到了最后，我觉得他们也还是在寻找去满足这个洞的一个东西。所以我想问你一下，你觉得这种饥渴感，这种 thirst for something 是源于哪里呢？是源于社会吗？还是源于女性别方面的东西吗？还是 what is it? Where is it coming from?
你要不要自己翻译一下？
Okay, yeah. So I was saying that while I was reading Rand's book, I had the feeling that all of these characters had, a black hole deep in their hearts that was expanding about to swallow them whole. And the characters are aware of this, whether consciously or subconsciously, and they are looking for something to fill up the hole. They're desperately looking for something to quench this thirst. So whether, some turn to sexuality, some turn to violence, whatever they turn to, I just wanted to ask Ran where she thinks that this yearning for something, this drive comes from, whether it comes from the society, whether it comes from culture, whether it comes from being female or not.
If I knew that question and if I knew the answer to that question, I would have a much easier life. But but I feel that what you mentioned, society, culture, these are all driving forces behind this sort of hunger. And for me, the hunger really comes from a feeling of being trapped. I think this also, I have this sense as well when I was reading Eva's novel. Like when you're trapped in an environment where you know all the people around you and you know how they're going to react and you know how things are, how the society works, there is a kind of, I feel like there's a kind of desire to break free from this kind of repetitiveness of everyday life. So for example, in my novel, when Chen Yesam first entered university, she found out that, all these people are speaking this way. All these people think, doing this is good, doing this is bad. Everyone has this set of moral values. And I think that Chen Yesam feels very trapped by this, even though it might not be explicitly said in the novel, or even though she might not know it herself. And the fact that it might not have much to do with whether she's a woman or not, because I haven't been a man, so I'm sure men experience this as well. But I think that the fact that she's a woman gives her a vehicle to break free, in the sense that, as you mentioned, in the book, she has a she has a sexual journey. That is more because I think is a way for her to break free from what is normally expected of a woman in this set of cultural values, in this set of social norms. And then she broke all that. So I think the sex thing and the female thing is really, a path for her to get out of it. But as you said, in the end, I don't know if she found it or not. I mean, I think like the part at the end of the novel, I did mention a little bit about how she sees a fish hitting the sky and falling back down. I think there's still a sense of, being trapped after all of this. And maybe I'll explore a bit more of those things in my next novel. I don't know.
I mean, there's definitely, I think, a sense of something has happened. At least something has changed.
Right.
To me, at least. It
also seems like nothing changed that much. I don't know if this is interesting to any other one. But yes. So I think that's also a question that I think a lot about myself. But I think, like, speaking of identity, I did want to ask you this. So in Braised Pork, Jia temporarily lost her identity after her husband killed himself. And for a while, she didn't know what to do with herself. So I think I wanted to ask you, do you think she found her identity at the end of the novel? Or how?
Right. Well, she had, like you said, she had, I guess, lost her identity, or I think I prefer to think of it as being her identity was tagged onto someone else's identity or someone else's perception of her or other people's perception of her. So growing up, she had always been, to her husband, she was some sort of more of an accessory, or, she filled up a space, and that was her identity. And she was okay with that identity. I don't think, she felt like that's what she wanted for a while, even though she was perhaps unhappy in the marriage. And of course, the marriage or the death of her husband sent her life on more of a chaotic journey where she didn't know whether everything she had believed in was true and was what she wanted and what was what she needed. So she was lost for, a big chunk of the story. And then I guess in the end, throughout people she meets and, more time for her to turn back to her own art and painting. And of course, by meeting the fish man and going into the world of water, she finds, I wouldn't know whether I can say she found her identity, because I think it's a very rare thing for anyone to be able to just find their identity like that, especially having been so confused about it for so long and so lost. But I think that she did find a sense of peace with the fact that she might not have the identity she is craving or she's looking for. So there is a sense of resolution in that, she's more at peace with everything. She knows that she needs to continue. It's a continuous search, and she is more aware of that towards the end of the novel.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think the novel ends in a very harmonized way. It's like a nice chord that ends the story. I, as a reader, feel very resolved. So I see what you're saying. By the way, guys, I see a question in the ask a question part that's about language. So maybe we could talk about that first, because we went over languages. May asked, thank you so much for your thoughtful discussion. You're welcome. I'm curious about whether or not you think about an audience when you're writing, especially as you navigate between different languages and cultures. Do you have a certain demographic or audience in mind when you write or after a book is published? Who wants to start first? Should maybe Eva， 你想唔想講下，即係你寫嘅時候有冇特別諗有咩觀眾啊，或者咩類型嘅人會睇呢本書，或者出版咗之後，你有冇諗過呢個問題咧？
或者我唔使你翻譯啦，我自己用英文講。And I think mostly Hong Kongers may read my books because I write in mainly Cantonese. And actually, when I write this book, I see my book as a part of Hong Kong literature. So actually, I haven't thought of Westerner would read my books because it is difficult to translate. For the Cantonese and also Mandarin dialogues, it is difficult to translate. And yep, so my book is so local, it's not international or worldwide. Yeah, that's my point.
Ran, do you want to? You go.
I go? Okay. I'll go. That's a great question because I discussed this with Eva as well when we met up last week. So when I wrote the novel, I actually really wanted Hong Kong people to read it. Firstly, the main character of my story, her name is Chan Yesam, and I think Hong Kong kids would get this, that Chan Yesam is actually, you know, the name that you have to use for your writing exam when you take your public exams, because you're not allowed to make up your own names, so they give you names to use for writing, and that's sort of like the background of her name. But so I had all these thoughts that I think, you know, only a Hong Kong person would understand, but due to, I guess, like political sensitivity, various reasons, my book now cannot be sold into Hong Kong as of now. So it's actually the physical book is sold in Taiwan now only, and so suddenly my audience has become a Taiwan audience, and this is not something that I guess I expected when I was writing the book, and I think that they would have a different take on the political situation that is described as well, but it is interesting to hear feedback when your demographic is different from the one that you intended from, I think. And even when I hear from the Hong Kong people who have read it, their reaction is still like very different or across different people from what I've expected. So I think the demographic thing comes naturally to me, but the result is very unexpected. And this also relates to Bonnie's question, by the way, about whether Ran Xu is a pseudonym, and the answer is yes, because again, as I said, because of the sensitivity of the book, I used a pseudonym and I wanted to remain anonymous. And the Chinese version of the pseudonym is actually许然but it's translated into Ran Xu because my friend told me that Ran Xu sounds like she ran, like 佢跑咗. And I thought that's brilliant. But then later I heard from some people that this makes people think I'm from a Mandarin speaking background, but I'm actually from Hong Kong. Okay, over to you, Anne.
Yeah, I didn't have an audience in mind when I wrote this novel. In fact, I still don't. I still don't know who's reading this novel.
Me,
Okay, so some Cantonese people, but I mean, for me, it was mainly a selfish reason to write it in English because I was interested in writing in English, and like for the reasons I've mentioned earlier, I thought it was a fun and challenging exercise. And I mean, I still write in English for the most part nowadays, and I find that it's a good way for me to make sense of some stories in my mind. So, I mean, my answer is pretty short. I didn't really have an audience in mind, and I think I do prefer it that way for my writing personally. Yeah. Actually, can I just ask a quick question about, since we're talking about language again, and you were talking about Tanyasam, whatever.
Whatever.
It's very elementary.
Name.
How do you say it?
Tanyasam.
Tanyasam. Great. Okay, so how that name is the name you have to use on exams, and I wasn't aware of that. And I think that just reminded me of how since it's her story, we don't really, half the time we don't know what language she's speaking in. Sometimes I feel like she's speaking in Chinese to Victoria. I wasn't sure whether Victoria spoke any Chinese. Sometimes I wasn't sure whether, for the most part, I wasn't sure. And I think that this must be a conscious decision by the author. And I was wondering if, so this lack of a clear language in her speech makes her seem more of like a 旁观者, of like a passive observer. And I was wondering whether, whether her lack of a distinct language helped her define her role in the novel, and is she supposed to be an observer, or is she what I don't know. What is she? I don't know if you can answer that, but yeah.
I think now that you've asked it, I think that she is actually more of an observer in the story, simply because I think her personality is more of a passive. She at least started off being more of a passive kind of person, being put into university, being put into this new environment, seeing all these different types of people interacting. She's more of a person who's observing and seeing where she can go. And in the end, I think she did go somewhere, but she was also pushed to that direction, I think, from the people around her. As to what language she was speaking, I thought about this a lot when I was writing, because it's so hard. I don't want people to not understand what I'm writing. So even though the dialogue sounded in my head like in Cantonese, Mandarin, and English for the different characters, I tried to use more formal Chinese for the most part, just for the sake of, easier reading for a wider audience. But in some scenes where the emotions are very intense, I try to use some Cantonese. Like, for example, some people would curse in Cantonese, because I think that's something that you cannot really show in Mandarin. Or what you said about Victoria, I didn't write it in English simply because most of the readers are probably Chinese-speaking readers. But there are some sentences that I wrote directly in English with a Chinese translation at the back, because I think those sentences just simply don't make so much sense in Chinese. Like, people don't speak that way in Chinese. So I had to write it in English. So I think that was the reason.
May I ask you 2 questions about the metaphor of fish? Because I found that when I read and both fish is a very important symbol, and just like representing something lost. And for许然, fish is also very important metaphor. Can you explain or elaborate more about that?
Sure. Do you want to go?
Fishman, you should start.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the fishman is, I guess it can be many things, depending on your read on it. For me, I've always...
To give some context, in your novel, the main Jiajia's husband died, and then he made a simple drawing of a fishman, did not leave any explanation of this fishman.
Right, and later on in the book, various characters come across the fishman, and then they talk, and then usually when they see the fishman, they see another world called the world of water, which is basically a world filled with nothing but water. Anyway, so that's what the fishman is. So to me, the fishman is more of, I guess I should start by saying, I'll try to be succinct, by saying that I think the reason why I wrote about the world of water is that I find it difficult to write about the experience I want to write about in purely realistic language. And just like how Jiajia is lost and everything feels rather hazy, dreamy, and uncertain for her, I think the best way for me, or like the most effective way for me to write that, was through surrealism and through the symbol of the world of water, whether it is the degree of realness, so to speak, of the world of water will depend on the character. It can be entirely real for someone, or it can be just an idea, just a thought. And so the fishman, I thought, was more of a guide between reality and irreality, or when reality and irreality are one and the same. It's a guide that guides you, back to what reality, or further down into irreality. And I think without the less abstract way to say that is, in real life, oftentimes I feel that sometimes if you can't make sense of how you're feeling, it is a very surreal feeling. And you might be thrown into a state where nothing makes sense. And I think usually when you are being thrown into this state, there is something, an object, a person, a word that you hear, or a sound of some sort. It can be anything that leads you between these two mindsets. And that to me was the fishman symbol from the get-go. But of course, as I kept writing, it became something a bit more complex, a bit more fuzzy even to me. And now I mean, its meaning to me sometimes changes as well by now. But for the most part, I like to think of it as being a guide.
Yeah. I see.
Yeah.
For me, I think the fish aspect of my writing, it's not as well. The line of the fish is not as clear as in Anne's novel, because I think for me the fish is more like usually a color that I add to Tanya Sam's character. She starts off dreaming about this golden green fish that swims in the ocean very quickly, and this was when she was feeling very trapped by her daily routine and the life that she has discovered to be the same every day. And she dreams of this fish that seems to be swimming towards some sort of freedom. And during her journey, the fish comes up several times, especially during sex scenes. Somehow, to me, a fish has this sort of sexual connotation to it, and I cannot explain why. But I thought it tied really well. I think it also offers a good, like, technical description of the sex things to make it a little bit more interesting. And then I think at the end, you will see a scene where the fish swims towards the sky and hit the sky and falls back down again. To me, I think that sort of is a good representation of how Tanya Sam was feeling at this time, where, you know, it seemed to her that there's a way out of this. It seems to her that the fish is swimming towards freedom, and then in the end, she sees it, you know, hit the sky, and it turns out the sky is just a glass ceiling. So I think for me, the fish is really more of a line that highlights Tanya Sam instead of maybe a major plot line. But it really helps me to tell the story behind the characters that I think is hard to tell by simply describing their lives. I think it's a good representation of their mental state and the way that the things that they are going through and the way that they see it. Yes. So I think we have 7 minutes left. Why don't we, I mean, given our discussion today is about writing our first novel, maybe we should talk a little bit about that experience. I want to ask everyone how you feel about having published your first novel. Have you always thought of yourself as a writer, or is this something that you just discovered?
Eva, you want to start?
Maybe you turn.
Maybe I start?
Yeah.
Me?
Yes.
You.
Oh.
I'm very interested.
How do I feel? It feels kind of, I don't know, because this year has been such a strange year already that getting a novel published just feels like another very strange thing that happened to me. It just feels like this whole year was not real. But it now that I've had some time apart from the book and from publication, I feel that I have a lot more that I want to write about that I didn't cover entirely in Braised Pork. And I've never thought that I'd be writing, having writing as a career. It was never really part of my career goals. It was just a hobby. It was a hobby I used when I was taking a break from business school, taking a break from work. And so now that it's become more of a career, I think my attitude towards it has also seen a bit of a shift, where I feel like there's more of an urgency inside me to to write about certain things I want to write about. Whereas before it was more like, you know, I had all the time in the world. I had all the time in the world to write the first novel. I might not have even finished it. I don't know. So at the time it was more like, oh, I think of something and then I might or may not write about it. And I will only write it when I feel like I had to get it out. Whereas now everything feels a bit more organized in my mind. And that I know, you know, I'm writing another novel. I know that I'm going to finish it. And I know pretty much what I want to write about. So I have a bit more certainty now, I think. All right, Dan, your turn.
My turn?
Or
I'll talk.
You guys fight.
For me, now that I've done it, I think it all makes sense. I've written, like I've always written without a consciousness of doing it since I was very young. I would be in class not listening and just writing down my imaginations. I think for me it's more of out of some sort of necessity. Like my brain just imagines all these things that if I don't write it down, I feel like there's a lot of energy trapped in my brain. So even though I've never consciously thought of myself as a writer, I just thought, you know, this is something people naturally do. Imagine things, write them down, until I got older, and then I realized that not everyone does this. And then I guess it slowly, and I read more, and then I realized how to put these things into a form. But I felt that even as a child, I've always just done it like over the years. So, but I never thought I could make it as a writer, like in this formal sense, because I've always thought that the things that I think about are so not like, so it's not something that people would be interested in. And even for this book, I've gotten reviews saying that, oh, this is such a strange book. So, but I guess now that I have more skills, I know how to put it in a way that makes more sense to other people. But I think it started off being something that's just really personal and really just from the deep depths of my heart. What about for you, Eva?
For me, actually, I write this novel not for publish. I write this for a writing competition, but the requirement of this writing competition is about 8,000 words. But when I write, I found that I exceed the demand and I write more words. And then so I find someone to publish, and actually I'm very afraid because it is very difficult to publish a book in Hong Kong, especially I'm not famous. And I just have won a competition, but it doesn't mean anything. And so actually when I write, I'm very nervous about I can't publish and I don't know how to go. And then I found a publishing, a friend holding a publishing house, and he helped me to publish the book. And so I start the journey of being a writer, but actually now I'm still afraid of I can't publish my second book because in Hong Kong it is really difficult because the publisher helped me to publish my novel is not a famous publisher in Hong Kong, and so now I still have this anxiety, and so maybe it is the difficulty of many Hong Kong writers.
So maybe with 1 minute left, let us know if you have any questions and we can address.
Thank you, Bonnie. Are you guys working on something else? I know, Eva, you said it's very, I think we all share this anxiety for our next project. Even though I'm not published in Hong Kong, I share the anxiety too. And I don't know how whether people like Braised Pork or not. So I don't know whether it was.
I love your book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it is. I think it is very interesting and very readable.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to see it again, and also the ending is unexpected. Yeah, I like your book.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, guys. We've run out of time. unfortunately. But thank you, everyone, for joining us here. And thank you for the questions, and thank you, Bonnie. I'd like to remind everyone that the event will be available to watch on demand until the end of November, with Chinese subtitles added after 48 hours. The Hong Kong International Literary Festival runs until 15th of November with 76 live and online events. Now, thank you very much again for joining us, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.